everybody. This is Julie Matthews. I'm a certified nutrition consultant, and I'm really very excited to be here with you for the Great Plains Laboratory webinar series. And I wanted to share with you some of the insights I've gained over the last 10 years in practice as a nutritionist. And today I wanted to talk about what you may be missing, or some of the components that trip my clients up that I wanted to share with all of you. So some of the I don't want to say secret information, but some of the information that you may not be aware of that might help you refine the diet further. So that's what I want to do today. I would say that probably the main thing that I do in my practice that I suppose makes me different from some is that I work with all the different various diets. And so what that provides is an opportunity to see which diets work for what things, what principles are important for different people, what symptoms are often associated with which foods or which compounds. And so instead of just kind of putting everybody into one diet, everybody into the same peg, I'm able to figure out based on people's symptoms and their lab testing and what they've tried in the past, which diet might be the best approach for them, or maybe what piece of the puzzle they're missing that might help them refine the diet further. So very often I will see clients that are doing multiple diets. So they might be doing the GFCF diet along with low phenols and low oxalate, for example, or somebody that's doing a specific carbohydrate or GAPS diet along with let's say low oxalate, for example. So I often get a lot of those types of clients, the ones that have tried lots of things and are now trying to refine things that are remaining. And so hopefully today I can share with you some of the things I've learned through that time of working with different layering and combinations of diets and putting it all together. So many of you might know me, some of you might know me, I don't know many of you, but I wrote a book called Nourishing Hope for Autism, and I also have a cooking course and series that's available online as well called Cooking to Heal. So what I found was that in Nourishing Hope is really all the nutrition and the science behind autism and the dietary and nutrition approaches for it. And I learned very quickly that I could create the most comprehensive diet in the world, but if my clients didn't eat it because they were picky eaters and things like that, then it didn't do any good. And so I'm just a home-based chef, and I practice a lot of my new recipes for my family that I use for all of the families out there. So those resources are available, and hopefully you'll find them very helpful. And so what else can I say? I'm a certified nutrition consultant, and I'm here in San Francisco, and I've spoken at lots of conferences, and I am thrilled to be with all of you today. So I just want to share just a few background slides. I find that while I intend to make this presentation a little bit more for parents that have tried lots of things, I want to at least set a framework because there's always new people on every call, and I want to just make sure I set a framework of understanding and launch into all of that. So autism in the mainstream is seen as a DSM-4 diagnosis, a psychiatric or psychological type of behavioral disorder, but people don't see all of the other things. I think that's my baby in the background, so if my husband is listening, he needs to mute himself or something, I'm not sure. Any autism, when we see autism actually as a whole body disorder, we see that what's going on inside the body, the chemistry of the body, is affecting what's happening in the brain. So the behavior and language and all of those components are not just some mysterious thing happening in the silo called the brain. The brain is attached to the body, and everything going on in the body is affecting what's going on in the brain. And so when we look at this chart on the left, that's from my book, in terms of the complexity of things that are going on inside the body, we see how that relates to the brain, which, as Dr. Martha Herbert coined, the brain is downstream from this whole body disorder. And so for example, if we have yeast overgrowth in the gut, though that yeast gives off toxins, and those toxins can go to the brain and cause spaciness or drunken-like behavior even. When we don't have biochemistry, methylation and sulfation working properly, we can't activate our neurotransmitters properly. When we have inflammation going on in, let's say, the gut, that also can create inflammation and an inflammatory response in the brain. When we don't have our detoxification systems working well, we get increased toxicity. Those toxins can directly affect the brain. When the gut's not absorbing the nutrients properly, we get more nutrient deficiencies. And of course, we need nutrients for every cell in the body, including the brain. And when foods aren't broken down fully, those proteins can act as opiates. And we all know what morphine and heroin and things like that can do to the brain. And so it has a very direct effect on the brain. So that's what we want to talk about, I think, is really important to talk about, is autism as a whole body disorder. So what are some of those main areas? If I were going to distill it down, I would say that what we most frequently see is the immune system, the digestive system, and the detoxification systems not functioning properly or ideally. Every child has a different bucket that's a different size, and so every child is different, and therefore all of the diets and supplements and everything will be different. But you can see how when there's an immune challenge, you get increased inflammation, you get a decreased ability to fight pathogens, and you have the opportunity for more food sensitivities. When digestion's not working well, that leaky gut and those bad pathogenic organisms can really affect our ability to absorb nutrients. And when detoxification isn't working, then we have to really be careful about the foods that we eat and the additives that might come in foods, as well as what we can do to boost up that detoxification, because all of those systems are going to directly affect what's happening in the brain. And so the power in all of this for diet is that all of these, when we're looking at the body and the health of the body, all disease begins in the gut, as Hippocrates said, who is the father of modern medicine. And really, I have always found that to be true. I don't know if I can really think of many people that have some health issue going on that don't have something with their digestion going on. Once you affect, well, maybe I should say it back the other way, that once digestion is negatively affected, it will affect the rest of your health as well. So the gut is in constant contact with food because every time we eat, it has to go through the system. So many people report that if their child is sick and isn't eating, or if their child had to have some sort of a procedure where they couldn't eat, they actually seem better for a few days. And we can see how that food is really having an effect not only on the gut, but all different areas of people or an individual's health. The reason the GI tract is so important is that it's a physical barrier against all the bad guys. The largest amount of serotonin is actually found in the gut. The largest part of the immune system is found in the gut. And we need the digestive system to break down our foods so we have the vitamins, the minerals, the amino acids for protein, and building blocks for things. Everything needs that good digestive system working properly. So we're going to talk about today things like when you have leaky gut and gut inflammation, well, you want to remove the foods that inflame the gut, and you want to add foods that help heal. You want to add foods that have good bacteria. When you have nutrient deficiencies, you want to increase the quality of food and the digestibility. This was always an area that had been missing for a long time in the world of autism and diets. And let me say, by the way, I should have explained this early on in my presentation, that my vast experiences with autism, most of my clients that are children with developmental delays have some sort of autism spectrum disorder. But I wanted to open this up to ADHD as well, because I find and have found through my research that there is a very similar underlying foundation for people that have autism and ADHD, that a lot of the same underlying health factors are present in both, and many of the same approaches benefit both. And in my opinion, Many neurological conditions, whether it's anxiety, depression, ADHD, autism, other developmental delays, they all have some root in the body. And I feel that kids with autism are the canaries in the coal mine, the ones that are the most damaged by toxins, the ones that need the most high-quality supplementation. They're the ones that when we figure out what works for them, it often applies to really almost everyone else. And so when I talk about autism, I might be using the word autism, but be aware that I think there's a lot of other health conditions, especially ADHD, that I'm really referring to as well, even if I don't mention them by name. All right, let me continue on here. So yeast overgrowth, when we see that, we want to remove sugars. We might reduce or remove starches. We want to add probiotic-rich foods. When there's toxicity, we have to be really careful about what's coming in from the food supply, whether it's our cooking methods, our storage containers, all of those things, the additives that are in processed foods, all of those are important to helping not add to that burden. And then when chemistry is not working properly, we might, in case of methylation and sulfation, which we'll talk about, we might need to remove phenolic foods, and we can assist in those biochemical processes through supplementation very frequently. All right, so what do parents report? Well, really, autism is a very foundational piece for biomedical intervention and helping children have the foundation for better learning. So all the time I hear parents tell me that their child, firstly, when their gastrointestinal problems are relieved, can you imagine if every day you had, let's say, diarrhea every day for years and years? I mean, it is really uncomfortable. So it wouldn't be surprising that they can't concentrate and focus very well. So even on a level like that, diet is really helpful. But it also helps on a biochemical level and helps improve things like language and attention and hyperactivity, helping with eye contact, better sleep, and helping with toilet training, and all sorts of things, helping parents to have children that are happier and healthier and on their way to better quality of life, and often a reduction in their symptoms, and even sometimes a removal of their diagnosis and a recovery from their condition. So I think there's many levels of improvement, and after speaking at conferences all over the country, and in fact throughout the world, parents all the time tell me improvements that they see in many of these areas. So I want to set the framework for our conversation today that I firmly believe that healing diets have two components. The first one is the one that everybody focuses on for the most part, which is an essential step, which is the removal of any problematic substances or foods. So those are going to be artificial additives or gluten intolerance, casein, phenols, salicylates, oxalates, anything you need to remove. All the diets are basically based on removing the offending substance for that person. But the second piece has not always and often doesn't come into the picture, which is how do we replenish the good nutrition and nutrients that these children so desperately need. And that is, it was often left out, I think partly because there's a lot of picky eaters, and we had spent so much time focusing on phase 1 that parents often didn't see phase 2. But it was really, really important for me when I wrote my book that I put in all the pieces of how to increase good nutrition and how to do it in a way that kids enjoy and like. So we're going to touch on that. So just keep that in mind, that to me, a healing diet does both of those things. All right, so just briefly, we're going to go through many steps in my book, so I just thought I'd give you a really quick framework. I start out talking about kind of the biochemistry and what's going on, and then what nutrients are really helpful, what all the different diets are, the pitfalls, the benefits, much of which we'll talk about today, at least some of the key ones to get us started. And then we're going to go through many stages of the holistic approach, but we're going to mix it all up because I want to make this kind of a really impactful presentation and give you some really key gems. So instead of starting at the beginning and going to the end, we're just going to pick out some of the things that I think are essential and focus on those in our time together. So here are what I would call the top 6 pitfalls, or maybe a better way to phrase that is what you might be missing currently in a diet. So the first one is gluten and casein. So many of you might already be doing a gluten and casein-free diet. So then I want to get into the importance of sugar and yeast overgrowth, grains as a whole, phenols and salicylates, oxalates, and then the lack of good nutrition, or how to get good nutrition in. So I want to start with gluten and casein for those people that aren't doing it already. But to me, yeah, I basically want to talk about those people that once you've done the GFCF diet, if you're not seeing the results that you want to see, what are some of the pitfalls, or what are some of the areas that you may have missed the first time around, or not been aware of, or aren't aware of yet, that really can help. Because I think a lot of people, fortunately, have heard of the GFCF diet, the gluten-free and casein-free diet. So anyway, I want to share a little bit of my experience here. Okay, so we're going to skip all the way to beginning an ASD diet. I'm going to talk a little bit about gluten and casein here. So there's food allergies and food sensitivities, and a food allergy is something like, a peanut allergy, where you break out in hives, or you go into anaphylactic shock, or something very acute and immediate and potentially even life-threatening happens. A food sensitivity is a delayed immune system response. So it's an IgG antibody rather than an IgE. It has more chronic type symptoms, so digestive challenges, inflammation, emotional or things like hyperactivity, anxiety, that sort of thing. It has a variety of sort of delayed reactions, and so it's much more difficult to identify it, because with a peanut, it's really fast and easy, unfortunately, to see that that's happening. Or I don't know if it's, I guess in some ways it's fortunate that you can see it happening, whereas with an IgG, you often don't, and so you'd have to take out the food for a number of days typically. So it's something that a lot of people aren't aware of, that could really be affecting their children, that a lot of times is missed, because usually people are looking at food allergies. And a lot of what we're encountering in autism is food sensitivities. Now, while some people, of course, with autism have allergies, and in fact, the population of children with autism have a higher percentage of food allergies, really a lot of the gluten and the casein is very often a sensitivity. Most common sensitivities are, in addition to gluten and casein, are soy, corn, eggs, citrus, peanuts, and nuts in general. So a little bit on gluten and casein. Well, why is it a challenge? I think, well, to me, there's many reasons. There's many challenges with gluten and casein. First, it's an IgG, as we mentioned. Secondly, it can create an opiate response, which I'll talk about in a moment. There's other inflammatory responses. There's autoimmune responses, like in celiac. If you have a problem with lectins, there's lots of lectins in gluten and casein. There's a variety of different things that can happen. So really the gold standard to figure out if your child is having an issue with gluten and casein is to try the diet. So with this, in the situation of opiates, what happens is that you have these long protein chains, and when they break into the individual amino acids, you're able to absorb and use those amino acids to build everything. You build neurotransmitters, enzymes, tissues, everything. If you don't break them into amino acids, if your digestion is weak, or you're having inflammation or various things going on, they'll only break into these large chains, not all the way down. And these large chains actually can function as opiates, fit in the opioid receptors, and create a lot of the symptoms that we see with opiate use. And a lot of the symptoms, interestingly, that we see in autism. So when digestion is working well, things get broken down. But children with autism often have diminished enzymes. And we know that DPP4, which is an essential enzyme to break down gluten and casein and the opiate activity, can actually be damaged by heavy metals like mercury and also pesticides as well. So we can see that enzymes are often deficient, and one of the reasons that these children that create these opiates are having this problem. So when the gut isn't healthy and the gut is leaky, then these long protein chains that aren't normally supposed to get through to the bloodstream get into the bloodstream and, like I said, acts very specifically like an opioid or an opiate. And these can actually be measured, and I'll mention that in a moment. But interestingly, what do we see? Well, we see lots of addictions to, in this case, to foods, because the foods are, in this case, what are creating those opiates and those addictions. You might see high pain threshold, spaciness, aggression, stimming, poor eye contact. These are actually all symptoms or potential symptoms of opiate use or opiate addiction. And so interestingly, we see a lot of these in autism. Maybe not so much the hallucinations, but I think it's a really just interesting connection. And what I love about Great Plains is they actually have a test for opiates. So that really can be helpful as a starting place to get an idea of what might be going on for a particular individual. Okay, so why does the GFCF diet work? It helps to eliminate the opiate peptides by not eating those foods. It helps to reduce inflammatory compounds. It helps reduce those IgG antibodies. It can help reduce the inflammation that contributes to leaky gut. And then there are, in certain processed wheat and dairy foods, there's propionic acid, and that's a study that Dr. McFabe found that propionate actually created autistic-like symptoms in the animals that were studied. So lots of reasons that the GFCF diet is helpful. And then just a little bit on some studies that I won't go through, but I like to just show how, you know, there's a study on ADHD and food sensitivities, asthma, autism, a variety of things. And so what I want to say is that, you know, the scientific rationale for diets really, in my opinion, is unquestionable. There are always people out there that try to say that it's not based on science, there's not this double-blind, placebo-controlled, da-da-da. Studies on diet are really tough because it's hard to make it blind on both sides because a mom has to feed them something. But the fact is that there are lots of studies showing diet works, and for every study that shows that it doesn't work, there's an equal study that shows that it does work, and often that one doesn't get noticed in the news. So gluten-containing grains to avoid would be wheat, rye, barley, spelt, kamut, and some of the others. You can get gluten-free oats, and so that I think is really helpful for people that can tolerate oats. And then there's a whole bunch of hidden sources, and I think that's the hardest part about the diet is all of those hidden pieces that can trip people up. But once you get the hang of the diet, it's very easy to avoid these things. It just takes a little work up front. So if it seems overwhelming, if you haven't started it yet, it really doesn't take much time before you can start to very easily recognize what has gluten in it. Casein-containing foods, so it's milk, animal milks of all types. So cow, goat, sheep, all of them and all of their forms, yogurt, butter, you know, all of those things. Now, what I will say is that in the gluten-free and casein-free diet, I always take out all milk of all animals. However, there are differences between cow's milk and goat's milk, which allows some people to handle goat's milk better, but it is a very small percentage of the population in my clinical experience that can actually handle goat milk. But for ones that you've heard that can, it's often because it's A2 versus A1 beta casein and some of the other attributes of goat's milk that make it different. I will also say that camel's milk is very, very different, and for those of you who are curious about that, I don't want to maybe confuse the people that are new, but if you're interested in camel's milk, I wrote a very extensive scientifically referenced article on camel's milk because I'd seen so many families and children on the spectrum get really wonderful results with camel's milk. So I will say that that is the only exception to the casein rule. But for anybody brand new starting out, I just say no milk of any kind, and then you can figure out some of the nuances later as you go. And I'm going to spend about, let's see, I don't know exactly how long I'm going to spend on this presentation, but I'm going to allow plenty of time for questions. So if you have any questions on those other types of milks and things, I'm happy to answer them. Anybody that's dying to check out the study as soon as possible, it's at my website, nourishinghope.com. Okay, and I said study, but I meant article. There's a number of studies that are referenced in the article. All right, so next is soy. I pretty much, when I say GFCF diet, I really mean gluten-free, casein-free, and soy-free. I almost never include soy in a GFCF diet unless a client, unless we have something very specific going on, and maybe we'll make a certain determination for a period of time or something like that, easing people in or something. But really, soy is very inflammatory to the gut. It is very difficult to digest. It has, it's broken down by the same enzyme as I mentioned, I think I mentioned earlier. DPP4 breaks down soy as well. So if you might get an initial benefit from taking out soy because, I'm sorry, you may get an initial benefit from taking out casein and substituting soy, but usually that will come back around to be somewhat problematic at some point just because of all of these things that soy is similar to casein and its inflammatory properties. So I try to avoid it. Now, it's the protein that people are usually sensitive or allergic to. So if there's a little hidden soy in something like vitamin E or lectins, it really is going to depend on the level of that person's sensitivity. So like fish oils almost always have some vitamin E, and that vitamin E is often derived from soy. I typically don't find it to be a problem unless you're allergic or very sensitive to soy. But I think it's best to avoid as much soy as you can, and totally if you can. Soy is very high in oxalates and phytates, or phytic acid, and those block the absorption of really important minerals like calcium, magnesium, zinc, and some of the ones that these are some of the ones that are really tough in autism. Sometimes lots of people have zinc deficiencies, and so we don't want to be adding foods that are going to bind to those important minerals and prevent their absorption. It can, I shouldn't say soy blocks thyroid function. It's probably more appropriate to say that large amounts of it can block or inhibit thyroid function. And also, it can affect the endocrine system because it has estrogenic properties to it. Some of the studies done on babies fed soy formula show lots of challenges with the gut and all sorts of things. So I'm not a fan of soy. I really often recommend avoiding it. Corn. I'm going to, back up a little bit and say, if you're getting overwhelmed and you're just starting out, you don't need to avoid corn. It's probably more accurate to say limit and maybe avoid corn, but that doesn't make a very good title for a slide. So, it's one of the top common allergens. It has high level of fungus that can feed yeast. It has terrible herbicides. It's often genetically modified. That genetically modified source does not have to be identified. Interestingly, the genetic modification of soy uses genes from a bacterial toxin called a Bt toxin, and this to me is the most fascinating thing. The way that this toxin works to kill the bug before it can eat the plant is by creating leaky gut in the bug. So, we are giving kids or adults foods that have genetic messaging that creates leaky gut. This is not a good thing, and so that's why I feel corn is pretty problematic for lots of people. So I would say that if you can tolerate corn, only eat organic corn. I mean, there still can be cross-contamination and in the fields, and that's really, a science and environmental experiment. But at least if you're eating organic can't be genetically modified, so at least we're doing something positive. And I find that not all of my clients need to avoid corn. Okay, number 2, pitfall number 2 is sugar and yeast. So there's various stages that refer to the use of sugar as well as the problem with yeast overgrowth. So sugar does a lot of things. Firstly, it feeds yeast. It also depresses the immune system, and it contributes to inflammation. Three really, really big factors in all sorts of neurological conditions. And so sugar is something we really want to avoid. It's not just cane sugar, but cane sugar is problematic because it's a common food sensitivity, and it uses a lot of chemicals in the processing of it. It's stripped down and doesn't have any good minerals left in it to help process that sugar. So that's a good reason to avoid that. But even the more natural sugars, they are still going to feed yeast. They still do have all of those other effects. They just have some minerals to help process them. They aren't as chemically processed, and they often are definitely better. But be aware that too much sugar is too much sugar, so you want to use better forms and as little as you can. My rule of thumb is that a serving of sugar is about 4 to 5 grams, which is about a teaspoon, and juice and dried fruits and ketchup have a surprisingly large amount of sugar in them. So, I'll briefly talk about yeast here. Yeast could be a whole topic and a whole talk to itself. Yeast really adds inflammation to the gut, contributes to leaky gut. It also creates an environment where other pathogens are much more able to thrive. It crowds out the good bacteria that would naturally be competition for the bad stuff. It creates a stress on the immune system because the immune system is constantly trying to battle and fight it off, creating kind of, I would sort of think of it as kind of exhausting the immune system. And then oxalates can really perpetuate yeast overgrowth, so we are going to talk about one of our pitfalls later being oxalate, and it will come back around to yeast, but also many other things as well. So with a yeast overgrowth, usually a focus on a kind of a caveman style diet is really a good way to go. So a diet that focuses on meats and vegetables. Caveman diets did not have any grains. They didn't have any refined grain or flour products, and they didn't have any refined sugars. And they really didn't have many sugars at all. So those sugars they did have were pretty scarce and used very, very, very minimally. So a diet normally consisted mainly of meats and eggs and fish and good fats or avocados or things like that, animal fats, vegetables, fruits, and nuts. There are a couple styles of this diet. One is called the paleo diet, and that one actually is a low-fat diet. That one is not my favorite. I much prefer the primal diet. That one happens to say that allow much more red meat and grass-fed fats and things that I would think is a little probably more true to a true caveman diet. So this caveman style diet, you'll see, doesn't contain sugars and grains and starches and things that are most likely to feed yeast. Now, I'm not going to go into all the yeast diets in this conversation. Some yeast diets do allow certain starches or certain grains, and they limit vinegars and moldy foods and yeast in foods and an excess of refined flours and things, but not totally eliminating grains altogether. So there's a variety of approaches to a yeast-free diet, or I'm sorry, a yeast-killing diet. But I think that this type of a framework is really important to starve out that yeast. And particularly, I want to make the point that sugar can really be a big problem for a lot of kids. So to me, one of the pitfalls is, a family's doing the GFCF diet, and understandably at the beginning, they just want to get those opiate foods out. They just want to get those inflammatory compounds out. So, and their child might be picky, so they do gluten-free muffins and gluten and casein-free cookies and gluten-free pretzels and crackers and all that stuff. And then, yeah, they'll see a level of benefit, but then when we see that plateau is sometimes because that sugar is now causing a whole set of challenges in feeding yeast and other things like that. So that is definitely, in my opinion, one of the first pitfalls that people find after starting the GFCF diet if they haven't taken sugar out to begin with. All right, the next pitfall is grains. And so this one to me is a little bit more refining the diet. So, you know, in my book, I talk about starting and beginning with an ASD diet. That's often a gluten-free and casein-free diet. Occasionally it might be an SED or a GAPS type diet, but often the refining it further to get to a GAPS type diet often happens in a little bit of a later stage. It doesn't really, it just depends on the particular person and where they get started and where they go to. So let's talk about grains. So grains have a lot of problems. They are definitely inflammatory. They're difficult to digest. They contain phytates and oxalates, and as I mentioned, the same as with soy. They also contain lectins, which I will describe in further detail. So grains are also problematic because we can mill them into a very fine flour and make crackers and breads and all sorts of delicious goodies. But when we mill them into that fine flour, whether we take the fiber out or not, that really, well, even if we take the fiber out, it's certainly worse. But when we mill them down like that, we are causing more impact on blood sugar. It goes into the bloodstream and raises blood sugar more quickly that way. And so avoiding the refined grains really has a help from many different perspectives. I won't go too far down this path, but you know, when we affect blood sugar, we can imbalance the adrenals. We put stress on the adrenals. The adrenals handle stress. So if you're a child with autism or ADHD and you are overloaded by information coming in on every angle, you have sensory sensitivity, you're trying to figure out your social environment, there are a lot of stressors on you. And if we add flour products and blood sugar to that mix, we're just tapping and stressing those adrenals and affecting our ability to manage stress that much more, as well as, of course, you know, decades down the line, we don't want to create any challenges with blood sugar. So grains, and particularly refined grains, are a big problem for many, many reasons. And that's why you'll see maybe about 4 of the different diets that I'm going to mention today are actually grain-free diets. Inflammation, so those compounds not only can create inflammation in the gut, but they also have the ability to inhibit the minerals, as I mentioned earlier. When you inhibit, when you create inflammation, then you can inhibit the absorption of all your nutrients when you're not able to digest and break down your foods properly. So they can have an effect on leaky gut and all sorts of inflammatory digestive conditions. They can create digestive discomfort. So I would say that at a minimum, I think soaking grains is really important. Soaking grains will reduce the oxalates, reduce the phytates. Fermentation will break down the lectins. So at least soaking and ideally fermenting them is a really good way to help us. And I think one of the reasons we have so much trouble in our society is that we eat tons of grains. We do not soak them like they did in a traditional culture. And so we have many things kind of going against us in the grain arena. Consider the GAPS diet or the specific carbohydrate diet or the primal and paleo that I mentioned earlier. All of these diets will remove grains. What I found is that, you know, a lot of times people will start with a GFCF diet and they'll get a certain level of benefit from that. Sometimes it's profound. I don't mean anything negative about the GFCF diet. I think it's a wonderful first place to start and often is very, very helpful and sometimes the only dietary intervention that someone needs to do. But this is talking about the pitfalls, so I want to share with you what to do beyond that. And so what I found is that people will often start with the GFCF diet and they'll get some level of benefit, but maybe they're not seeing all the digestive support that they wanted. Maybe they still have diarrhea or constipation or inflammation or gas or, you know, those kinds of things. And then it brings up the question what to do next. And so you might look at sugar, and then you might actually consider whether you want to keep grains in the diet or not. So lectins, I'll just talk a little bit more. I really find it very interesting that all of the SCD diet, GAPS diet, paleo, primal, they're all essentially a reduced lectin diet. So I think there's really a piece to lectins. And for a while, there was a parent group that dealt with lectins and the problems with lectins and certain supplementation to bind up those lectins and all sorts of things like that. I think that there's a missing piece that a lot of people don't talk about here. But anyway, I think I'll just mention a couple things for those people that are curious. It's a protein that's not broken down very easily. It's resistant to digestion, the stomach acids and the digestive enzymes. It's resistant to soaking. It really requires fermentation or some other way of really breaking those down. It starts to kind of coagulate the blood, cause kind of blood clotting type, not true blood clotting, what they call agglutination of the blood cells. And the blood type diets and things like that are based on these lectins. What can happen is that these lectins can bind to the gut wall and they can damage the gut lining. And so then if the gut permeability is altered, other food proteins that pass into the bloodstream can now create an immune system response. So kind of a similar sort of a leaky gut concept created. And then lectins actually in circulation can actually be very damaging to organs and things like that. And I think some of the disease processes we see may have a component of lectins that we don't talk about too much. But I think the most important thing here is that grains are a problem for a percentage of children and adults, and they are something to consider removing, even though it is a little bit more challenging to implement a diet like this. It really has a lot of benefits for people, so I think it's really important to share. So the specific carbohydrate diet is a diet that was created many years ago. Elaine Gottschall wrote the book Breaking the Vicious Cycle and brought it to the autism community. I had the pleasure of meeting and speaking with her when she was alive, and she really was an amazing pioneer for many families with autism. It removes the disaccharides and the polysaccharides and focuses only on those single sugar molecules that are easily digested and absorbed without having to need a lot of enzymes. A lot of children with autism have deficiencies in their carbohydrate digesting enzymes. So what happens is that if you eat monosaccharides, those sugars absorb very quickly. They're not left around in an undigested state for the bad bugs, the yeast, the bacteria, those kinds of things to break down and consume as food for themselves, feeding them and making them stronger, at the same time creating more damage to the digestive system, creating more mucus, more inability for the enzymes to get to the food. So she coined breaking the vicious cycle, so that we break that cycle and allow the bad bugs to go away, the healing to take place. And it really is an amazingly wonderful diet for many people. Lots of amazing stories about children with and adults with a variety of inflammatory bowel conditions where the specific carbohydrate diet has been very helpful. I think a key part of that are the grains themselves, but they also eliminate other starches. So they eliminate potatoes, corn, they eliminate, which I would consider a grain anyway, they eliminate soy, all sugars except honey, all of the starches, the thickeners, the mucilaginous fibers like seaweeds and things like that, the pectins, chocolate, all that kind of stuff. But when you really get down to it, you can eat meats and vegetables and fruits and fats and nuts, eggs if you tolerate them, certain beans but not all beans. And so the diet actually is pretty well rounded. It's just that we have to remember that firstly, it's not a low carbohydrate diet, and it is it's a diet that really, once you get the hang of it and realize that we don't need a diet centered around carbohydrates and breads and pastas and all that kind of stuff, it actually gets, pretty easy to keep this diet going. But certainly it's a very big shift from what we're familiar with in the kind of mainstream American diet. The GAPS diet was created from the specific carbohydrate diet by Dr. Natasha Campbell McBride, and she did something wonderful, which is added step 2. So she added the healthy portion, which I really appreciate. So lots of broths and fermented foods and all sorts of good nutrition and nutrients and supplements and things that are really helpful to make the diet that much more nutrient dense. So I think that either one of these diets, they're very, very similar, but they actually have different kind of implementation guidelines, and they do have some different rules. And we could get into specifics if people have questions later, but I'll just leave it at that for now. And then just a quick difference between SED and GAPS and paleo-primal. They both don't allow grains. Paleo-primal is a little bit more strict. It doesn't really allow sugars at all, whereas the others do, and sometimes add, depending on the person, they might add quite a bit of honey-based treats, which really might not be advantageous to everybody. It doesn't allow, the paleo and primal diet doesn't allow any beans, whereas SED GAPS allows certain ones, and those beans differ from those two, from SED and GAPS, so just something to know about. Paleo and primal, it's not really a diet that allows potatoes and sweet potatoes per se, but there is the option of some occasional tubers, whereas in SED GAPS they're totally off limits. And paleo and primal is no dairy, but then some people do an optional dairy. You know, it kind of depends on whose philosophy of you're talking about. Whereas SED and GAPS does allow dairy if it's fermented, so the sugars are fermented out. Now, I always recommend doing SED and GAPS with no dairy to start, and GAPS actually is no dairy to start. So just a few differences in case you were curious. Okay, next I want to go on to phenols and salicylates. And if any of you have read my book, you might recognize that this is a really near and dear topic to my heart. It is one of the first ways I got involved in autism nutrition. When I first started researching autism nutrition, I met Michael Lang, and he recovered his children from autism, and one of the key pieces was phenols and salicylates and sulfation chemistry. So I think I have 50 or 75 pages of, or at least I did at one point, of information on this biochemistry and on these food substances. So I want to share some of my experience with you, because I do a lot with these foods in my clinical work. Okay, so you can see step number 6 is address phenols. So phenols are, I won't go into too much, but basically it's a particular type of a benzene ring with a hydroxyl group on it. All that means is it's an aromatic ring. So when you think about phenols, they're often things that have a lot of fragrance to them, like rosemary and different herbs and spices and certain fruits and things like that. They don't always meet that rule, but they are an aromatic ring, and it's interesting that many of the herbs and spices for sure meet that requirement. Salicylates are a naturally occurring type of phenol, so I sometimes use them interchangeably, but phenols also are artificial things like artificial colors, flavors, and preservatives, propionic acid. They all have a phenol ring and chemistry at their base. And then salicylates, things like aspirin is salicylic acid, and then certain fruits and vegetables, whether they're organic or not is really not relevant. They will, in fact, sometimes organic has even more, but I wouldn't not choose organic. It's just they have naturally occurring fruits and vegetables, and certain plant foods have salicylates, and we'll talk about some of the ones that are highest that you might want to avoid. To me, the primary thing I hear over and over again, the classic symptoms of phenols and salicylates are red cheeks, red ears, and hyperactivity. But it can be anything from fatigue to digestive disturbances. I've had a number of clients that started sleeping through the night when they addressed phenols, and that is really a godsend to many families, as you can imagine. So you can see a variety of different things here that you might want to look at if you want to consider those. And there's two dietary philosophies that address these. These are the Feingold diet and the failsafe diet. And I'd like to share a little bit about that. But let me just firstly explain the pitfall a little bit. I have had many clients share with me, either in our work together or before they even came to see me, this scenario. They did a GFCF diet. They might have done the specific carbohydrate diet, and they get a certain level of benefit, but they weren't able to really address maybe the hyperactivity, or they had this up and down behavior that they couldn't quite figure out. And it wasn't until they removed the salicylates that all of a sudden, all that benefit they were hoping to see from the GFCF diet or the specific carbohydrate diet, now suddenly it's clear to them because it was being masked by these salicylates that were creating all of this other stuff going on in the forefront. So I think this is a really a piece that often gets left out. Also want to talk about this is a chart from my book. It goes into that biochemistry. So I'll just share very, very briefly. The top box is methylation. The green stuff is transsulfuration. And the little orange box is sulfation. And sulfation requires all of the stuff before it to be working so that you can build sulfate, so that you can make an enzyme called phenol sulfotransferase, PST, and that enzyme processes phenols. And so you need all of this kind of biochemical stuff working in order for that to work. So that's where I think a lot of people get, that's why I think a lot of children have trouble with them. Rosemary Waring did a lot of work showing that a really large percentage of children, a majority of children, had trouble with sulfation and with processing these substances. And this is what we see in the ARI, Autism Research Institute. Many of the doctors there have noticed the patterns that show that they really aren't building the cysteine and glutathione and the sulfate that they need. So it's really not surprising that they have a problem processing these phenols and salicylates. The first one is artificial ingredients and additives. Definitely remove those. I would say that would be the #1 thing that anybody and everybody can do. You don't even need to change your diet. You don't even need to get rid of candy. Just get rid of the candy that has artificial colors. Get rid of the cereals that have that stuff. Of course, I'm taking my nutrition hat off to say that to all of you, but the reality is that this is a really simple, basic first step that anybody can do, and they might see some really amazing changes in doing this. And then you can look at other salicylates. So some of the big ones, almonds, honey, fruits and vegetables. So a lot of times, understandably, parents feel that, ooh, my child eats tons of fruit, that's so great, which it would be in normal circumstances, but it might not be, and one of the reasons they might be eating so much fruit is a similar process to gluten, where you kind of get sort of addicted to these chemicals, and then you want to eat them, you crave them. So that's one thing. The other really common pitfall I see is if you go on a diet, say the specific carbohydrate or the GAPS or something like that, you might substitute your breads or muffins for lots of almond flour muffins with honey. So now you got two really huge salicylates that just came into the picture that again might be clouding the positive results you are hoping to see. The Feingold and the failsafe diet, the failsafe diet takes this even further. So it also eliminates other salicylates that are allowed on the Feingold diet. So I might start with the Feingold elimination and then make it more strict if those results aren't enough, or if they're not seeing the results from those food choices. So Feingold, for example, allows avocados and broccoli and spinach and watermelon and a variety of herbs and spices that definitely are not allowed on failsafe, and I find to be quite a problem for many people. So it's worth looking into taking the salicylates a step further if you tried the Feingold diet and you didn't see the benefit that you were hoping for. Amines, I'll just briefly say amines are kind of, they're processed by the same pathway as the salicylates, so if you have a problem with one, you might have a problem with these as well. It's certainly something to consider, again, if you're not seeing the results you wanted from eliminating salicylates. If you do the failsafe diet, it will naturally eliminate or reduce these quite a bit. That's where bananas comes in, because bananas are actually not high salicylate, but they often get taken off a lot of lists, and people think of them as salicylates, but it's actually the fact that they're amines. So a lot of people with salicylate sensitivity also avoid bananas for the reason of amines. If I were to come up with one thing that amines do over and above salicylates is sort of aggressive, defiant type behavior. So I had a client where just removing these amines significantly, almost, I would say almost eliminated, or at least for a period of time, completely eliminated a lot of the aggressive episodes that he was having. So I think that it's, again, a piece of the puzzle, something to look at, something to consider, the role of amines, especially if you've looked at lots of things and it hasn't been those. It's worth considering this as a possibility. And these kind of creep up on you. They kind of build up over time a little bit more than the salicylates that are a little bit more immediate. And the other part is glutamate. So glutamates create a lot of hyperactivity. That glutamic acid, that the glutamate is an excitatory neurotransmitter. It makes you sort of like kind of hyper and sometimes not able to calm yourself down, creating some anxiety. Glutamates are interesting. They can affect almost every single system of the body by the way that they affect the brain and everything. So, you know, you can avoid MSG and autolyzed yeast and yeast extracts, those things that are very high free glutamate, as well as certain foods. So a lot of times I'll look at what foods a child really loves, and if they love something that I might consider strange, like Vegemite or seaweed or something, then I start to think, you know, could there be, or they just love Parmesan cheese and none of the other cheeses, or they love soy. Those, I just think, ooh, is there something going on with glutamate? So something to think about. Number 5, oxalates. This is one of my very, very, very favorites. So let me spend some time on this. This is, to me, a really important refining piece. A lot of people, this is a much newer diet, so a lot of people haven't necessarily been that aware of this diet, but I think it's very important because oxalates are these sharp crystals that we normally think of in relationship to kidney stones, but you don't have to have kidney stones. And in fact, a majority of the children with autism, they did a study that came out in the last 6 months, and they found that children with autism that did not have kidney stones had levels of oxalate consistent with someone that would have primary hyperoxaluria. In other words, they have a lot of challenges with oxalates and they don't have kidney issues. And it was the first study of its kind. It's very, very exciting news. So, you know, I want to just kind of point that out to people. They're very inflammatory. Since they're those sharp little crystals, they're very inflammatory to the gut when you have a leaky gut. So think about, let's think, we have the perfect storm here. We need good bacteria, probiotics, to break them down. And we need a good gut barrier to not allow them to get through. And so in the presence of a leaky gut, you're going to be absorbing a lot of oxalate that can be very inflammatory. It can lodge in the tissues. It can perpetuate gut inflammation. You know, it can perpetuate yeast overgrowth, and it can kind of mimic, well, sort of mimic yeast overgrowth. Here's a common pitfall. So people with oxalates, an issue with oxalates, they often will, quote, dump oxalates. So sort of like, it's kind of what it sounds like, sort of detoxify them or dump them into their system. And when those problematic dumps, I mean, you want, how do I explain this? I'll just keep it simple for now. When this dump happens, it often creates a yeast flare. So people will often think they're dealing with yeast, which they are, but it might be because of oxalate, not something else. So just something, again, to consider. If you, a lot of parents on the oxalate board report that no matter how much they did SCD or other diets, in some cases, they were not able to get rid of their yeast overgrowth till they addressed oxalates. And upon addressing oxalates, they had really great improvement in their gut and yeast and all of that. So I think it's a very exciting area of study. I use the low oxalate diet a lot in my practice, and I have really seen very good results, and I'm very excited about its potential. So things for people to be aware of. What can I say here? They can be very addicting, so often they'll crave things. Again, if you crave something strange like spinach, I mean, I ate spinach when I was 5, but I didn't love it, and I didn't eat tons of it. You know, if you eat tons of high oxalate foods, it's something to consider. Also, there's a lot of things. Improvements in energy and sleep and motor skills, and I talk about a lot of the symptoms that parents commonly see in my book. So I go through motor planning or motor skills and all sorts of different things that people might want to think about. When I think of oxalates, I also think of mitochondrial disorders or other things that are happening on the cellular level. I don't think we have enough research to know this for sure yet, the role in mitochondrial disorders, but what we do know is that if there's not enough sulfate, so going again to that sulfation and phenols, if we don't have enough of that, then we can shuttle oxalate into the cell on the sulfate transporter. And I guess the important part for all of you is that it basically kind of like gums up the works of the cell. It can gum up the mitochondria, it can gum up the energy production, it can gum up blood sugar, all of those kinds of things. So I think there's a really big implication that we still need to really know more about, because it really, you see improvements in lots of interesting areas. So another pitfall in the oxalate piece is that you could try a diet like the specific carbohydrate diet or the body ecology diet, which again are wonderful diets, but depending on how you implement them, they can be really high in oxalate. So you can be helping on one area and then really causing a problem in another, especially if you are one of those people who has a genetic difficulty handling oxalate. So to me, oxalate is either large amounts of issues with oxalate, in my opinion, are either large amounts of oxalate dumped into somebody that has a leaky gut, or a genetic inability to handle and process oxalate, or you might be even creating oxalate. So, so those are some things I think people might want to look at. Here's just a couple examples: nuts, beans, beets, Swiss chard, spinach. And let me just give you an example. A low oxalate diet is about 40 to 60 milligrams of oxalate. A quarter cup of almond flour has 450 milligrams of oxalate. So it's like that 1/4 cup is 10 times the amount of oxalate that someone would be allowed on a low oxalate diet. So you can see you can end up with a lot. I had one client that calculated 700 milligrams of oxalate a day that her son was getting. Before she realized it, she was adding spinach to broths and all this kind of stuff. So something to definitely be aware of. And there are lower oxalate options. So in other words, there are some seeds you can do. You can't do nuts. There are some good greens you can do if you don't want to, since you wouldn't want to do the other ones. So there are choices that are low. All right. The other thing that's great about Great Plains is that they have an oxalate test in their organic acid test, which I think is really interesting and helpful. It's the only one of its kind that I know about. Now, I would say that even if you don't necessarily see things totally out of whack here, I think that you still might consider the low oxalate diet, because we're still learning that there's differences in oxalates in the urine versus oxalates in the plasma, and people that have challenges. So I think that if you do a test and you see something high, I think that's really a valuable piece of data. But if it's not high, I wouldn't say that you don't have a challenge with oxalate. And yeah, I'll leave it at that. Okay, let me do my last pitfall, and I'm going to go through this really, really fast because we have 25 minutes left, and I really want to get to your questions, which I'm sure is the most interesting part to all of you. So pitfall number 6 is not enough good nutrition. So the pitfall would be not enough. The solution would be boosting that good nutrition. Good fats, vegetables, juicing foods, or juicing vegetables, fermentations, good quality meats, and bone broths and stocks. So let me, this is really step number 7, which I go through much more extensively in my book in terms of really good foods. And then, of course, the cookbook's all about how to get these good nutritious foods into kids, particularly picky eaters. So I want you to realize that as I go through these good foods, I realize that we need to make these kid-friendly, and that's actually what I spend a lot of my time doing. All right, so why do we need good nutrition? Because good nutrition affects our genes. It affects the genes we turn on and we turn off. So if you are pregnant, want to get pregnant, this is really important. But if you have a child or an adult, you can affect your genes by what you eat every day. So that's one of the really good reasons we need to get good nutrition in. I'm just going to really quickly, we need good saturated fat. It does so many things. It's villainized in the mainstream, and yet it has many amazing properties. Coconut oil is one of my favorites. Cholesterol is also really important. Another thing that's very demonized, and there's some interesting research out there. There's actually some interesting things that Dr. Bill Shaw's written about cholesterol. I think cholesterol is definitely an important component in our food, and making sure we get it is really crucial. So I would not personally limit cholesterol foods. I personally wouldn't limit them for anybody, just as a general rule of thumb, but particularly kids. I can't really think of a reason. Liver. If you are allergic to eggs, so you know, the most common one you think of is, you know, chicken eggs or duck eggs or something, but some people are allergic to eggs, so you can do fish eggs. You can do good animal fats, meats, liver, and actually New Beginnings, if you're working with your biomedical doctor, actually can has a supplement, a cholesterol supplement for those kids that are allergic to eggs and are having trouble getting enough cholesterol, that actually have really low levels that are problematic. There are actually solutions for that as well. So, but for most of us, good quality animal foods, well-rounded diet, including red meat, including animal fats, I think they're wonderful. They're higher in all sorts of good brain fats, fat-soluble vitamins that are good for the immune system, and then avoiding commercial, or I guess it would be more, I should say conventional rather than commercial meats. Organic is good. It's not going to have antibiotics, hormones, pesticides. That's really important. But organic is often not grass-fed. Grass-fed takes it to a step further, and I highly recommend you finding 100% grass-fed or what they call pastured foods. So like chickens aren't grass-fed, so you wouldn't find grass-fed eggs, but you'd find pastured eggs. You'd find pastured pork, whereas you'd find grass-fed beef or grass-fed lamb or grass-fed dairy. So just a little distinction when you're asking farmers and things. And the Weston A. Price Foundation is a really great place to go for this. So westonaprice.org. Find the chapter leader near you and contact them and find out where they get their good sources. And you can often go in with them, buy things together, get a good price, and get the best quality you can find. This is how I find my soy-free and corn-free eggs that are also pastured. So you can really, there are some really amazing people out there that have sourced and spoken to the individual farmers pretty extensively. So we want to encourage eating vegetables. Vegetables are rich in all sorts of nutrients, and we want to cook them in a way where it's got a good texture. I like to do things like kale chips and carrot chips and vegetable latkes and things that are crispy and crunchy. For kids that won't eat them outright, pureeing them is a really good way to go. And I have lots of vegetable ideas and recipes because obviously this is one of the biggest areas of challenge for many parents. One of my favorite ways of doing vegetables is juicing. If they'll eat vegetables, great. You'll get the fiber and all sorts of other important things. But a lot of times kids don't necessarily like them, or they don't eat that many. So juicing is a wonderful way to really concentrate those nutrients in a small space in a texture that kids like, because most kids like juices. Or you can add it to a smoothie or something like that. So for kids that don't like mushy or, you know, that kind of stuff, juicing is often a really great way to go. And bottled juices do not have a lot of the nutritional value, because the storing and the pasteurizing can really affect those nutrients. So fresh, squeezed, pressed juices is what I'm really thinking about. Fermented foods, really important, rich in all sorts of good bacteria, Lactobacillus acidophilus, all those kinds of things that we hear about that are good for the gut, inflammation, the immune system, breaking down toxins, all sorts of things, populating the good bacteria, crowding out the pathogens. We need good probiotics, and you can get them in supplement form, but I find a lot of times that getting them in food form really helps them to colonize better. And this is just my theory and my personal experience, but it does to me make sense. They're alive. They're growing on their food source. They don't have to wake up. They don't have to find food. They've got everything going right there. And so I really feel that fermented foods are a wonderful addition. They also help with pH balance in the gut and all sorts of other things. So I'm a really big fan. If you have any of my cooking stuff, my Cooking to Heal, I spend 45 minutes describing how to make sauerkraut. Even though it's a simple thing, I love making it. I love all the nuances, and I love the science experiment in your kitchen and all that good stuff. So don't be afraid of making them. You can make them very cost effectively and use the vegetables that work for your child and all sorts of good things. So raw sauerkraut or other cultured vegetables, every culture has them, kimchi, all that stuff. If you're doing dairy-free, you can do nut milk yogurts. You can make them yourself. You can buy some of them, like coconut yogurt. Kombucha contains good yeast that kill yeast, coconut kefir as well. Lots of choices that you have that I think are really wonderful addition to most people's diet. Broths. Broths are a really easy way to assimilate nutrients and certain amino acids. They really help with kind of getting nutrients in a form that's very easy to absorb. So bone broths particularly are a really wonderful thing. You can add vegetables to your bone broths, but I'm really thinking of the benefits of those bones and getting the nutrients and things out of there. I'm going to leave that at that for now. So just a little for people, I really want, I hope you can hear my passion in my voice. I love what I do, and I really want to help families, and I tend not to be, I don't know, I don't tend to toot my own horn too much, but I, at the same time, really want people to get access to things that they've found really helpful. So I really want to encourage you to think about whether my resources could be helpful for you. So my cooking series, what I love about it is every recipe is tagged with the dietary compliance. So I tag everything. Well, firstly, everything in the book is GFCF and soy-free, with the exception of maybe one or two things in the fermented section, which are very heavily labeled. But everything is GFCF and soy-free. SCD, low oxalate, body ecology, fine gold, failsafe, anything that's nut-free, egg-free, any substitutions I can make, I've experimented and tagged those substitutions so you read it and figure out what you need. So if you're doing the specific carbohydrate diet and the low oxalate diet and you need to be egg-free, you can go to those very specific recipes, which I think makes life really nice. I talk all about the fermentations, how to make your own nut milks if you're allergic to milk or if you don't want all the additives and the thickeners. Really good vegetable recipes, some of the basics, chicken nuggets and juicing recipes and desserts and all sorts of stuff. And so it includes a cookbook, but then also my whole cooking course on DVD. So it would be like being at my live class, but a lot of people weren't able to make it to my live class, so we decided to videotape it and make it available to all of you and anybody that might want to find it that can't come. everybody again. I'm Julie Matthews, a certified nutrition consultant here in San Francisco, and I work with people all over the country and all over the world by Skype and by phone, so even if you don't live in my area, if you think I can be helpful, I would love to help you excuse me, with a consultation or anything I can do. Speak to your group. Excuse me, sorry. Speak to your parents group, anything like that. I'm coming to the East Coast in a couple months. It hasn't been officially announced, so if you want to join my newsletter list, you'll find out when I'm coming. And if there's anything I can do, please let me know. And I also want to thank Great Plains for this opportunity. Thanks so much.